Welcome everyone to another build guide, and this time around we're going to be talking about the new Xilonen. She's the newest 5-star support, and she's actually a broken support. She is easily going to change the meta, and in this video we're going to go over how, and most importantly, how to best build her. So without further ado, let's get into her kit and how to play her. So the first ability I want to talk about is going to be her skill. It is a staple of her kit and is where most of her support capabilities actually come from. So when you use it, Xilonen will rush forward and attack enemies, dealing damage based on her defense. This attack will bring her into the Night Soul Blessing state, and she'll gain a set amount of Night Soul points. Using her skill will also put her in a special state where her normal attacks are actually converted into a new set of attacks that use her rollerblades. These rollerblade attacks deal geo damage. Now for the broken part of her skill, you'll notice that Xilonen's Night Soul bar has these 3 arrows to its left. These arrows are called samplers. When Xilonen has enough Night Soul points to actually reach a sampler, she will apply an element resistance shred to the enemies you're fighting. Now on Xilonen's own, she will have geo-samplers, and these geo-samplers will be active. There's no sort of Night Soul building you have to do or Night Soul points that you have to build up for geo, it automatically applies. However, there is thankfully a way to actually change the element of her geo-samplers, and the way you actually do this is through your team. So say for instance you have 2 pyro units and 1 hydro unit. The elements in your team will automatically be reflected in Xilonen samplers, but it is important to note however that Xilonen cannot shred every element in the game. Instead, it's only the swirlable elements, so specifically pyro, hydro, electro, and cryo, in addition to geo as we just went over. In this scenario where Xilonen does have non-geo samplers, they won't be activated on its own, as they are for geo. Instead, the way that you activate them is first by accruing enough Night Soul points to actually reach the samplers, and the way that you gain Night Soul points is through using her rollerblade attacks. So when Xilonen has enough Night Soul points to reach a sampler, whatever element that sampler is, Xilonen will apply a resistance shred of that element. So say she reaches a pyro sampler, she'll then dish out a pyro resistance shred. As great as this is, the only caveat to this is that the shred only occurs when Xilonen is on field. There is a way to actually fix this. Upon maxing out her Night Soul points, Xilonen will actually consume all of her points, activating all 3 of her samplers. When all 3 are active, the resistance shred occurs even when Xilonen is off field. Therefore, when you're playing her as a support, you want to first activate all of her samplers before switching off of her. This does however create a big problem when it comes to mono geo. If Xilonen has just geo samplers, which of course she'll have with mono geo, she won't be able to max out her Night Soul bar and cause for the resistance shred to occur off field. To actually have her geo resistance shred occur off field, you'll have to combine your geo unit with 2 other non-geo teams, and of course this is possible, but this of course does also do away with mono geo. And this really sucks since I wanted a geo healer for mono geo and to use with Furina, which unfortunately isn't going to happen, but honestly, while this is a really big bummer, I can't deny that Xilonen is absolutely broken. But we haven't got to her burst, which honestly just furthers her as an even more broken support. When Xilonen uses her burst, it will first off deal AoE geo damage, and this is nice, but the thing is though is that there's actually 2 forms of her burst. So when Xilonen has 2 non-geo samplers, she'll actually dish out healing at set intervals to your entire party. This healing is actually really good since now not only is Xilonen able to buff your team considerably, now she can actually heal and cause healing that will actually work towards Furina's fanfare stacks. But for the case where, let's say Xilonen has 2 geo samplers, so not all geo, just 2, her burst will deal additional damage. Last but not least, let's talk about Xilonen's other passive talent, which activates when Xilonen reaches her max Night Soul points. She'll trigger a Night Soul burst, and in the instance that another one of her teammates actually trigger a Night Soul burst, her defense will be increased. With this in mind, when you're leveling up her talents, first focus on her skill as this is the ability you'll be using the most, and count towards her elemental shred. Next up, upgrade her burst to improve its healing, and now you can ignore her normal attacks. Next up, let's talk about the best weapons to use on Xilonen, and the first, no surprise, is her signature, but actually what is a surprise is just how unique the sword is. Right away, the sword increases defense, so Xilonen's damage and healing will be improved. But interestingly, the passive has this mechanic where the more defense Xilonen has, or at least the wearer, the greater the damage bonus the sword will give to the team. At max, it gives 25.6%, which is actually really nice, and given the way that you'll build Xilonen, which we'll soon get into, it's really easy to actually max out the passive. Other than this sword, you want to go for any other sword that grants defense. A great choice is the Flute of Spitzal. I definitely didn't butcher that. This sword is part of a line of craftable weapons that grant a butt ton of defense, and as such is perfect for Xilonen. Close to this weapon is the Cinnabar Spindle, and the good news about this sword is that it falls short to the Flute, though not by a lot. You don't have to go through this whole pain where if you don't have the Spindle, you lack a defense sword. There's already the Flute, so you don't have to worry about it, but if you do have the Spindle, you are better off just going with the Spindle since, again, the difference between the two swords are really not that much. The difference is just 16% defense. Another set of weapons you can give to Xilonen is going to be energy weapons, seeing as she may struggle with energy. So you can use the Favonius sword, the Skyward Blade, or any other ER weapon. Other than these, your best option is to then give Xilonen any sword that increases your team's damage. A great example is the Freedom Sword. As for early game swords, you can use the Cool Steel for team damage, Skyrider Sword for energy, and finally the Handy Sword for defense. Now let's get into Xilonen's artifacts, and this is really important as there's a set that makes Xilonen an even more broken support, believe it or not. But you guys probably know already what I'm talking about. It's Hero of Cinder City. This set is easily her best as it's able to give a 40% damage bonus to Geo and whichever element you use to trigger Crystallize. It basically turns her into a second Kazuo, which is great since Kazuo is of course amazing, but even then just from a purely damage standpoint, it's absolutely broken. In the case you're not able to use this set, you could opt for 4 Archaic Petra for a watered down version of Cinder City. It'll give a damage bonus to whatever element you use for Crystallize, but it won't give it also to Geo. On the other hand, since she scales off of defense, you could give her 4 Husks to increase her defense, which would likewise increase her healing as well as her damage. Speaking of healing, you could give her 4 Maiden's Beloved to purely focus on her healing, in addition to Ocean Hued Clam for a set that improves healing while also dealing damage. You also have the option of giving attack to your team through Noblesse until you get something better. There's also the mix and matching of 2 pieces if you'd like, the best of which is going to be 2 Husk and 2 Emblem. For those in early game, use Defender's Will and any energy set like the Exile. For main stats, equip a defense percentage Sens or an energy one if your Xilonen struggles with energy. For the Goblet, once again, equip defense percentage. There is also Geo damage, but I'd recommend against this since Xilonen is primarily there for supporting her team rather than personal damage. For the Circlet, you have a lot of options. The best is going to be healing bonus to max out her support potential, but there is also defense percentage for a middle ground between defense and healing. And finally, though it's not the best, there is also crit rate. When leveling your artifacts, aim for the substats of defense percentage, energy recharge, and then crit. Alright, let's quickly get into Xilonen's Constellations. Her Constellations do further her potential and viable teams quite a bit. First up, her C1. This constellation will increase the amount of time she can traverse with her rollerblades and be in the Night Soul Blessing state. The constellation will also grant an interruption resistance to the active party member, meaning that your team will actually be more protected by her and she can actually substitute Zhongli. Next up, her C2. This constellation is her best when considering the amount of damage you gain and the money you have to spend. Off the get-go, when her source samplers are active, the units in your team that are of these elements will gain these respective buffs. Now for the big part, Xilonen's Geo samplers will always be active. What this means is that the whole thing about her Geo Shred not being active with just Geo members is completely done away with, making her able to fit into mono Geo teams. The only downside to this is that this constellation does not fix her inability to heal when in Geo teams, so Ito is not going to be able to use Farina, which hurts, trust me. Finally is her C6. This is the strongest of her constellations and it has a lot of tech, so to put it simply, Xilonen will have more time while in the Night Soul state. Plus her rollerblade normal and plunge attacks will be massively increased. She'll also give out healing to her party because of this constellation, so with C6 she can be played with Farina in Geo teams. Now let's get into some great Xilonen teams to play her in, and I gotta say, it's probably obvious, Xilonen can be played in all kinds of teams. Really, in any team that Kazuha is played in, she can be replaced and in certain cases actually do better than him. I'll mention some teams that stood out to me, but if you really want to get into some great teams, look out for my dedicated team video in the future. Anyhow, the first is gonna be Xilo with Benny, Navia, and Xiangling. No joke, this is probably one of Xilonen's top teams, and definitely is Navia's best team. I don't know why Hoyo is constantly showing love to Navia. She's already broken as it is, but here we are. In this team, Xilonen is going to shred the enemy's resistance of both Geo and Pyro, in addition to granting the 40% elemental damage bonus to Pyro and Geo. These buffs are absolutely massive and is going to make Navia and Xiangling completely broken. They will be so strong that legitimately no one should stand in your way. If you have this team, be sure to try this out. On the other hand, you can replace Benny with Farina to have Xilonen's healing trigger fanfare stacks. With Farina, both Navia and Xiangling are going to get so much damage bonus that Benny is probably going to be better for his attack, but this team should produce more Crystallize, and even then, if this team has a lot of damage bonus, it's something you can never go wrong with. On to our next team, which is kind of crazy for me to even speak about. I don't know what Hoyo is doing, but it is a Neuvillette team. This guy was already broken, and now he's being buffed with the Xilonen. It's insane. Throw a bone to my guy Ito, but anyways. With this team, you're gonna have Xilonen, Farina, and a flex bot. Just as the last team, Xilonen would produce fanfare stacks and give a huge amount of Hydra damage bonus to both Farina and Neuvillette. And Farina, of course, will do the same thing, so the two will really hit hard, both her and Neuvillette, but especially Neuvillette. For the final team member, essentially you can use whoever you want. You could even use Kazuha for even more elemental damage bonus, but I recommend a defensive unit just so that Neuvillette isn't constantly being interrupted when he's doing his charge attacks. Here you could go for any shielder, Zhongli is a great option, or you could go with Dia for her interruption resistance. For the third team, let's switch things up and talk about a mono team. Truthfully, with Xilonen, she can actually bring back some mono teams if she's paired with Farina. An example of such a team is going to be Mono Hydro with Ayato. Ayato, of course, has been pushed back pretty hard. Neuvillette has basically taken his place, and with how good he is, unfortunately, Ayato is basically never going to be taking it back. But anyways, you can have him do a bit of a resurgence by pairing him with Farina, Xilonen, and Yelan. Of course, everyone here is going to get a huge amount of elemental damage bonus, and Ayato should actually do really well since with both the elemental damage bonus and Yelan, his personal damage should be really high, including as well Farina's and Yelan's. Well everyone, this is my Xilonen guide. I hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing. If you have any questions, be sure to ask me them in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and take care.